Alright, good morning people. We are going to start with a new chapter on human physiology, and that's basically breathing and exchange of gases. An important chapter, not only from your board perspective but also from your competition perspective as well. So breathing and exchange of gases, we have a lot of questions because it is from human physiology, and obviously a lot of chemical reactions happen to take place. We need to understand all the cycles. Different boards have covered till the 10th standard in bits and pieces about respiration as a process. We have kind of touched base with concepts like Krebs cycle or maybe glycolysis. Then we have electron transport chain. So these have been covered in bits and pieces, and these will be dealt with in detail in this chapter. Okay, so we need to pay attention on all the aspects of this chapter, a very important chapter because it is concerned with human physiology, and a very important part because without this survival is next to impossible. Okay, so we'll start with this chapter, breathing and exchange of gases. Now what basically is breathing? Breathing is basically inhalation and exhalation. Okay, so breathing and respiration are different, and we have studied it in previous classes as well. So breathing basically occurs in two stages. One is inspiration, that is an active process, and the other one is expiration, that is basically a passive process. So this expiration is as a result of inspiration itself. So that's the reason it is known as a passive process, and this is an active process. Inspiration is the start. Okay, all right. Now respiration is what? It's basically a biochemical process by which organic compounds are oxidized. We know that organic compound here we mean glucose. Okay, so glucose is basically oxidized, which means that addition of oxygen takes place. See, oxygen is already here, but here the addition of oxygen takes place in order to get it converted into carbon dioxide. So addition of oxygen takes place to liberate energy. The energy is liberated from food. So basically food, oxygen is added and energy is liberated from food. This energy is released as a stepwise process. Now understand this, people. If this energy is released all of a sudden, it is going to be so huge an energy that it's going to blast the cells, and the cells are going to die. It's like an explosion within the cell that will happen. So this energy has to be released in a stepwise process, and this stepwise process is basically the process of releasing ATPs, that is adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so this energy is released in a very stepwise process. Otherwise, if it is released all at once, if the energy is released all at once, it might result in a brief blast of light. It will be like an explosion within the cell, and with which it will result in the death of the cell. Okay, and the death of the cell itself, this energy is trapped in chemical bonds of adenosine triphosphate. So this is basically trapped in chemical bonds of adenosine triphosphate. So what happens? The ATP is basically called the universal energy currency. Okay, this is for all living organisms, and this ATP is basically universal energy currency. So or a carrier. Okay, when a cell requires energy, the ATP undergoes hydrolysis to form ADP, and eventually energy is released. Okay, so the ATP undergoes hydrolysis to form ATP, and eventually energy is released. So what are the kinds of respiration that we will have? One is anaerobic respiration. We all know there are two types of respirations, anaerobic and aerobic. Anaerobic is basically without the assistance of molecular oxygen or air. Okay, so it happens primarily in very unicellular organisms like some bacteria and yeast. Okay, generally in small unicellular organisms. Otherwise, it also happens in human beings, where when we are basically, this happens in skeletal muscle cells. The site will be skeletal muscle cells. When we are actually into heavy kind of sports or performing some vigorous exercises, so this happens there. And it also happens in RBCs of mammals. So it includes human beings as well. We all know that RBC is designed in such a way that even the nucleus is not present in that cell. So it is designed in such a way so as to accommodate maximum amount of oxygen. So if nucleus is not present, obviously mitochondria is also not present, and mitochondria is the site of aerobic respiration. So in this case, the cell is without mitochondria and hence RBCs perform anaerobic respiration. So in case of anaerobic respiration, the oxidation of food happens without the molecular oxygen. So without the involvement of molecular oxygen, the oxidation of food happens. One glucose is releasing 2 ATPs. So one glucose molecule will release 2 ATPs only. One glucose will result in formation of 2 ATPs. Hence, it is an inefficient process because 2 ATPs is hardly any energy. Okay, so 2 ATPs is not a very sufficient amount of energy. So in anaerobic respiration, the oxidation of one glucose molecule gives us precisely 2 ATPs, very less. So it is also known as fermentation because this is the process by which a lot of industries, especially the alcohol industry, runs. Okay, final products are different in different organisms. So the final products of this type of respiration is different in different organisms. For example, in yeast, the final product is ethyl alcohol. Whereas if you look into human beings, the final product in skeletal muscle cells is lactic acid. This lactic acid is carried by blood again to the liver. Okay, yeast of bacteria, if you see, the final product is ethyl alcohol. So it depends. Different organisms have different final products based on the way in which the process of oxidation is carried out in the respective cells. Okay, so we will deal with the aerobic part. Okay, and here we have dealt with the anaerobic respiration part. Okay, so we will deal with the aerobic respiration part now. Okay, aerobic respiration is the most important form of respiration out of both the modes of respiration, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic is more important because in aerobic more amount of energy is released, and this is the process, this is the actual process in higher organisms. Okay, so it occurs in all higher forms of life, mammals, we human beings, cats, dogs, etc. Okay, so it occurs in all higher forms of life. In this, the molecular oxygen is used for the oxidation of food. So the molecular oxygen which is available from air or the surrounding medium is used for the oxidation of food. Highly efficient because highly efficient as compared to glycolysis, because glycolysis is primarily a process which happens in the cytoplasm. Okay, but this process primarily happens in the mitochondria. Aerobic respiration primarily happens in the mitochondria. Highly efficient in comparison to glycolysis, as it releases 38 molecules of ATP. It basically produces 38 molecules of ATP from one molecule of glucose. One molecule of glucose on oxidation gives 38 molecules, whereas if you compare in anaerobic respiration, one molecule of glucose, its oxidation is giving us just 2 molecules of ATP. So as compared to anaerobic respiration, aerobic respiration is far more efficient. So we will quickly look into the differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. I am sure these are differences which you have studied in earlier classes, but certain points were missing. So we'll just cover it up. Nutrients oxidized in the presence of oxygen. We all know this. Nutrients oxidize in absence of oxygen. So whatever carbohydrates or glucose forms we have, they are basically oxidized in absence of oxygen in anaerobic respiration. Occurs in cytoplasm as well as in mitochondria, both the sites. In anaerobic respiration, the sites are both cytoplasm and mitochondria. This occurs only in cytoplasm. This occurs only in cytoplasm. Hence, if you look back in RBCs, humans and mammals, the RBCs do not contain mitochondria. They only contain the cytoplasm. Hence, in RBCs, anaerobic respiration takes place. Okay. Complete oxidation of glucose. Why complete oxidation? Because if you look at this entire compound is broken down into carbon dioxide and water. We have learnt about this equation in previous classes. So this is a complete oxidation of glucose plus energy in the form of ATP is released. So nothing will be left as a residue. The entire compound of glucose is broken down, releasing carbon dioxide and water plus energy. This is incomplete oxidation of glucose, which forms lactic acid. Lactic acid is formed in skeletal muscle cells when we undergo rigorous forms of exercises, this lactic acid is basically carried to the liver by blood, or ethyl alcohol, which happens in organisms like yeast during fermentation. Okay, so this glucose again is converted into lactic acid plus energy. See, it has not been released into carbon dioxide and water. So this has been converted into lactic acid. Again, this glucose is converted into ethyl alcohol plus carbon dioxide plus energy is released. Okay. So these are two methods in which, if you look, that there is a residual compound in both the cases. In the case of humans, it is lactic acid is produced in skeletal muscle cells, and in the case of yeast, it is basically ethyl alcohol. Okay. Now this is the most important part. This is the most important part because one molecule of glucose, when it is actually oxidized by aerobic respiration, gives us 38 molecules of ATP, and that's a huge amount of energy. 38 molecules of ATP are released, whereas in this only 2 molecules of ATP are released, and that's very less. 2 molecules of ATP are released. This occurs in most of the animals. This occurs in lower organisms like yeast, bacteria, germinating seeds, parasites. Okay, it happens in yeast during fermentation, bacteria, some bacteria, germinating seeds. This happens in parasites like tapeworm, and in certain tissues of animals like, let's say, RBCs and skeletal muscle cells. Okay, so these are basically the sites of or where the anaerobic respiration takes place. Okay, now what are the phases of aerobic respiration? There are two phases basically. One is the external phase and the other one is the internal phase. When we talk about respiration, we are talking about complete oxidation of glucose. Okay, so there has to be an intake of oxygen for the oxidation of glucose. This intake of oxygen is coming under external respiration. So external respiration primarily means the gaseous exchange that takes place between an organism and its surrounding medium. Now this surrounding medium can be gaseous, as in case of us, or it can be either water as well, aquatic as well. Okay, so it can be, it's a basically gaseous exchange that takes place between an organism and its surroundings. So it's a physical process of exchange of gases between organism and its surrounding medium. So oxygen is taken in, carbon dioxide is released. Oxygen is taken in and carbon dioxide is released. So exchange of gases takes place through respiratory surface, and this process is known as diffusion. So exchange of gases takes place. So oxygen is taken in, carbon dioxide is released. So there is a particular respiratory surface wherein this exchange happens. For example, let's say in plants, the respiratory surface is stomata. Okay, so that's the respiratory surface. Okay, now in internal respiration, what happens is the cells or tissues undergo this respiration is happening at the cellular or at the tissue level. The chemical process that involves breakdown of organic molecule. Organic molecule primarily means glucose. So this is basically primarily a chemical process, and this releases energy in the form of ATP. This process can either be aerobic or anaerobic, as we have learnt earlier. So in the phases of aerobic respiration, we have two stages. One, the external respiration, in which primarily the exchange of gases happens, and two, internal respiration, in which primarily the chemical breakdown of the organic molecule of glucose happens, and this happens by two processes, aerobic and anaerobic. We have learned what these processes mean, where they happen, and what is the benefit in terms of the energy that is produced in both the processes. Okay. Okay, so we are going to talk about the two processes that we have, that is photosynthesis and respiration, which has been taught or maybe discussed in earlier standards, but a lot of confusion happens within students, and there are a lot of questions framed as well on these two. So we'll quickly go through what is basically photosynthesis and respiration. We already know what is photosynthesis. It is the process of production of food in plant. This food comes into the food chain because there are other animals which consume this, and then other animals consume them as well. So this is the main source of food. Okay, so it's basically an anabolic process. Anabolic process means the fusion of two or more molecules to form a final product. So basically it's a constructive pathway. More of molecules combined. We all know that it is an anabolic process. Why? Because carbon dioxide and water, which are inorganic substances, combine to form an organic substance or product, which is basically glucose. So it is synthesis is taking place. That's a synthetic pathway, and hence we call it an anabolic process. Whereas if you look into respiration, it is a breakdown process. Okay, this is a synthesis process and this is a breakdown process in which the glucose molecule gets broken down into carbon dioxide, water, and approximately 2830 kilojoules of energy are released. So that's basically a catabolic process, respiration. Carbon dioxide and water are used for synthesis of carbohydrate molecule. We can see that inorganic carbon dioxide and water molecules are combining to form organic glucose. Okay, in this the carbon dioxide and water are released during breakdown of carbohydrate molecules. So carbon dioxide and water are basically released during the breakdown of carbohydrate molecules. In this, carbon dioxide is taken in and oxygen is given out. We all know the process of photosynthesis which is performed by plants. The carbon dioxide is taken in and oxygen is given out. In this, the oxygen is taken in and carbon dioxide is given out. Very common thing which should be known to all. Takes place only in presence of light. This photosynthesis will not take place, we have studied in photosynthesis of higher plants, this will generally not take place in the absence of light. Whereas if you look into it, respiration is a continuous process that happens throughout the lifetime of an individual. Okay, energy in the form of light. So this energy is basically trapped. This energy is trapped by chloroplast, chlorophyll, whatever, and this energy is trapped in and stored in carbohydrates. This is the energy which is basically stored in carbohydrates, and the breakdown of this energy again releases energy in the form of ATP. So here the energy is stored, here the energy is released. In this, the energy is actually stored, and that's why we consume food produced by plants. Energy is released here in the form of ATP. Results in increase in dry mass. Increase in dry mass, why? Because carbohydrate is produced. So this will result, it's an anabolic process. So hence carbohydrate is produced or results in the increase of dry mass. Whereas here it is decrease in dry mass. See, this is the dry mass which is getting, so we hardly have any residual component here. Here the residue is increasing after the reaction. Here the residue is decreasing after the reaction. So this will result in the decrease in dry mass. Certain points of differences between photosynthesis and respiration. Now we will go into the fact of or rather study what is basically a respiratory surface. See, as we saw in aerobic respiration, there are two processes, external and internal. Internal means basically the breakdown of the organic molecule, whatever it is, glucose, sucrose, whatever it is, and external means the exchange of gases. Now this exchange of gases has to happen through a surface. This surface is known as respiratory surface. So it is a physical process of gaseous exchange, and hence respiratory surface should have certain following features. It should have certain characteristics of features which will support the process of respiration. So one, it should have a very large surface area. Why it should have a very large surface area? So that maximum amount of diffusion can take place. The more is the area, the more is the diffusion. The more is the area, the more is the diffusion. Okay, should be thin. Okay, why it should be thin? Because if it is thin, gaseous exchange takes place so that the gases can basically diffuse properly. So hence it should be thin. Okay, should be highly vascular and permeable to allow exchange of gases. Should be highly vascular. Why? Because vascular means there has to be a sufficient supply of blood. More blood supply will result in more of gaseous exchange. Okay, so this should be highly vascular and permeable to exchange of gases. So this should be permitting the exchange of gases. Highly vascular means there should be enough of blood supply, because we know that blood is the only one which carries or that supports the exchange of gases. So it should be richly supplied with blood. Okay, then it should be constantly kept moist. Why it should be constantly kept moist? Because gaseous exchange takes place through liquid medium, and when oxygen is dissolved in water, so the oxygen that needs to be taken is dissolved in water, and hence it should be constantly kept moist. Okay, now if there are certain pigments which can actually help in the process of respiration. What happens is oxygen or carbon dioxide basically binds with these pigments. Okay, so certain respiratory segments can bind with carbon dioxide and oxygen and help in their transport. So these pigments will be basically more or less an accessory organ for the process of respiration to take place. So these were certain things about respiratory surface as well as about photosynthesis and respiration. We will look more into what are basically respiratory pigments.